Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. If you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either major party, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels more than two parties are needed, we believe two parties is too few, and every week we talk about the problems caused by the duopoly and the reforms we can put into place to fix it. This week, we have a popular Democratic mayor choosing to run for governor as an independent. We have a declining youth vote, and we have a lesson from a humble island nation on ways we can improve our lot here in the United States. We know how to cram a lot into 30 minutes, and we're going to do it today. But first, Shawn, I'll let you do the honors because you shared this story with me yesterday.
Yeah, so Portland, Oregon is very unique as a city because it uses proportional ranked choice voting. It's one of the only cities in the country to use this particular method of ranked choice voting. Just as a refresher, ranked choice voting, you rank candidates in order of preference, first choice, second choice, third choice. If no candidate gets over 50% of the vote, last place candidate is eliminated. Their voters' next choices are added to the tabulation, and that process continues until someone has over 50%. In Portland, in 2022, they completely overhauled their government. They expanded their city council to 12 seats. They added 4 voting districts where 3 seats per voting district would be elected at the same time using proportional RCV. And proportional RCV works the same way as single winner, except the threshold is 25% plus 1. And so they used this method for the first time. The city of Portland then commissioned an exit poll to determine how well voters understood ranked choice voting and understood proportional representation. And what they found was 9 in 10 voters understood how to fill out their ballots. Most people understood ranked choice voting. They understood proportional representation. However, some of the news stories that come out of that was that there's room for improvement because in certain areas, slightly less voters said they understood it. But city officials are looking at the data and they're very optimistic about what they've seen so far.
Yeah, I read that story about room for improvement, and I disagree, Shawn. I disagree with the author, and I'm going to tell you why. So I found the story really interesting because what they talked about was how the areas that had the greatest difficulty understanding it were also the areas that traditionally had the lowest turnout. And these also happen to be lower income areas in Portland. And again, I'll summarize for the listener, but the gist of it was, turnout's low because most of the people in those areas don't feel the system's working for them anyway. So they don't feel like their vote really matters. So the fact they're confused by it, does that make a big difference? I don't think so.
Well, and it's the first election too.
Yeah.
This is a district on the eastern side of Portland. As you said, low income, very diverse population, a lot of families, so very young population too, that feel underrepresented. In the city's history, only 2 city council members have been elected in at-large elections from that community. Only 2. So you can understand why they feel underrepresented, why they feel like their vote may not matter, and why, as a result, they don't want to participate in the process or didn't, except now they are guaranteed 3 seats in city council. Look at the math. At least 25% plus 1 of the vote is needed to get 1 seat. And there's 3 of them. So at least 75% of the people who vote are electing someone to the city council.
Yeah. I don't think the voting system is going to make a huge difference in turnout, despite what people say, until they start to see a difference in it, number one. Number two, the fact that they would point out or call out whether a new voting system is confusing when there are so many things in the voting process that are deliberately confusing, like ballot design and reassigning polling places and all these other things that make it tougher for voters.
Right.
Why would they call this out? And then the last thing I have to say, and this isn't even in the story, this just works my last nerve, is when somebody says ranked choice voting is complicated.
Yeah.
Like, that is the dumbest thing. Do you have 3 favorite movies? What are they? 1, 2, and 3. What are your 3 favorite pizza toppings? What are your 3 favorite cereals? Like, the list goes on. You can do that. You do it all the time. So the idea, like, that sounds complicated.
It's so insulting to voters to say that they're too dumb to understand this system when they rank things in their daily lives, as you said, every single day. And city after city, jurisdiction after jurisdiction that uses this method, when they poll voters after they use it, they find that most voters understand it after the first use.
Yeah.
And then you get people accustomed to a new voting system, which that's the case for any new system. Any change is going to require some adaptation. It's going to require some adjustment. It's going to require voter education, and it's going to require informing voters on how the system works. I think as reformers, there always needs to be an awareness that there's always room to make people better informed of how a system works. There's always room for that. So the fact that still a healthy majority of voters, even in this district, that felt like they were underserved by the city in terms of information, being put out there, still a healthy majority understood it. Yeah. When they polled people who had never heard of ranked choice voting, 69% said they understood how to do their ballot.
Yeah.
And they had never heard of ranked choice voting before.
Yeah. Because people do it all the time. I'll just offer some unsolicited advice to the activists out there in the think tanks trying to explain it. Because I see this a lot in reform-related content, talking about how voters polled understand it. Like, when somebody says, isn't it confusing? The response is, that's a stupid question. This is why I'm not in PR, Shawn. But honestly, like, it's the dumbest argument. Everybody can rank a top 3, a top 4. Everybody can do it. They do it all the time. Okay, I do it when I want to pick where to go out to eat with my kids because they can't agree on anything. Give me your top 3. It's always the Olive Garden.
Yeah,
always the Olive Garden.
Always the Olive Garden. It's the breadsticks, man.
That's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
So I think we've successfully lit that concept on fire. Let's move on to the main story. I'm going to let you do the honors again, Shawn, because you also found this story. Just a little backstory for the listener. Shawn finds everything. I just show up and shoot my mouth off. It's great. It works for us. So go on, Shawn.
So for members of the audience who haven't heard, because honestly, in a news cycle, you're probably not going to get, this information. But in Detroit, the mayor, Mike Duggan, has announced that he's going to run for governor. Now, he's a Democrat right now, but he's decided that if he wants to govern effectively, if he wants to govern the way that he's been governing the city of Detroit, which 10 years ago, 11 years ago, filed for bankruptcy, today is a thriving democracy seeing economic and population growth it hasn't seen in decades, right? He thinks that the only effective way for him to govern is to run and govern as an independent, which I find to be fascinating. We have seen this before. It's long shot odds that an independent, even a popular independent, can win, but he's got a record to run on in Detroit.
I found this one really interesting because is it Duggan or Duggan?
I say Duggan.
Okay, we're going to say Duggan because Duggan, and I don't know, listener, if it's Duggan or Duggan. We're just going to call him Duggan. So much for research. So the thing that I like about this guy, or the thing that I find really interesting about this guy, is that he already saw a very crowded Democratic primary field with a number of progressives. And we've talked about this before, how when you get into a primary, people are really tacking to the party base. So in that primary, people are going to tack to the left. And all the things that Duggan has done to improve Detroit would actually be a liability because he has managed to increase corporate investment in Detroit, increase occupancy rates downtown, improve emergency response times. And he's done this all by working with pro-business Republicans,
Mhm.
as well as police unions, fire unions. He's really built a coalition from across the political spectrum. And that works, right? It's
Right.
proven to work in Detroit. He gets into a Democratic primary, they're going to use that against him.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about him is that he is exemplifying the type of politician that we've discussed in previous episodes is what voters really want right now. And that is a politician that can build a personal connection with voters, someone that voters can actually feel that kind of sense of, this person's actually listening to what I'm saying. Because when he ran for mayor and even as his time in mayor, he held hundreds of these house parties, sitting in people's living rooms, listening to what they had to say, talking with them about the issues, and he responded to that. He responded to the needs of the city by both catering to corporate investment, but also investing money into the city's infrastructure itself, making communities safer. Crime is down exponentially in the city under his leadership, and like you said, he's gone to the state capitol and built allyships with Democrats and Republicans, these unique coalitions that in our partisan system are practically unheard of because, as you said, in a primary, if you're making friends with the other side, that's a liability to your success in that primary. And so now Duggan running as an independent doesn't have to worry about that. He can kind of set the narrative himself about what his campaign's about and run on this tripartisan, multipartisan, whatever coalition you want to call it.
Yeah, now the interesting thing is that, as with all independent candidates, people are already throwing out the idea that he could serve as a spoiler. He
Yeah.
could effectively split moderates, split the moderate left, and you'd end up with a Republican governor in a state that's arguably left leaning, despite the recent presidential election results. And again, this is another situation where ranked choice voting could really solve that problem.
Right. And if you're the Democratic Party, you're already looking at this past election cycle and you're wondering, how do we move forward? Losing ground on a number of ballot races, including, losing once again to Trump this time around. Notably, though, neither Harris nor Trump got a majority in that state, which is, of course, always something to note. But this also has to be considered a serious blow to the Democratic Party, because to lose someone who has the popularity and the success record, and somebody who, sure, he does cater to corporate interests. He does reach across the aisle to get Republican donors and supporters to also back these initiatives that have changed Detroit for the better. He could have been a rising star in the Democratic Party despite all that.
Yeah.
And now the Democratic Party has lost that option.
And I think that politicians are increasingly being presented with the choice of either following the votes or following electoral incentives. And they're not aligned anymore. Because we've talked a lot about how party primaries can potentially work against candidates who would do very well in the general election.
Mm-hmm.
Party primaries are generally elections where party members are voting, highly partisan voters are voting. And if we look demographically, you and I have talked about this before, the number of independents is growing year over year. The number of people who ally with neither major party is growing. It's the largest voting bloc in the United States. You were actually the one who brought this to my attention. In the most recent presidential elections, independents actually outnumbered Democrats in terms of ballots cast.
Yep.
And this brings us to another piece of research you and I were talking about, which is some recent research by Unite America on the youth vote. So, we talked about how the majority of voters right now are independents. Well, that percentage increases as the cohort gets younger. So to put this in real numbers, 27% of people age 65 plus are registered independents nationally. 30% 50 to 64. 38 30 to 49, and 45%, nearly half of all 18 to 29 year olds are registered as independent nationally. And I think the troubling thing about that isn't necessarily that they're not finding a home in either party, but is in the lack of trust they have in the current political system. So, this research also showed that 64% of people 18 to 29 believe their votes don't matter, which is bad. Like, that's a crisis.
Awful. Yeah, it's going to lead to lower turnout among the youth. I think an interesting thing to note is that on top of this research showing that each generation as they come into voting age is more independent than the generation that preceded it.
Mm-hmm.
But on top of this research, Gallup did polling earlier this year, or maybe it was towards the end of last year, where they found that millennials came into the voting pool independent, and as they're getting older, in their 30s and in their 40s, they're staying independent, which is breaking historical trends where the older you get, you typically, you'll choose a side because the system makes you choose a side, essentially. So the older you get, the more likely you are to vote, the more you tend to just, decide between the Democratic and Republican Party. But what they're finding is that even as young voters age, unlike any other point in history, they are staying independent. They're keeping that independent ID because, as you said, they're not feeling served by the current system. They don't feel like their voice matters.
And I don't blame them.
Yeah.
I absolutely don't blame them. They have gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to cost of education.
Mm-hmm.
They've gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to cost of housing. And if you are a millennial entering adulthood trying to build a life for yourself, it's very, very hard.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard right now. And so and neither side is materially addressing the issue. And I would argue too, I'm going to have some folks on the left who are going to hear that comment and they're going to say, oh, well, Democrats want to enact these policies, but the Republicans won't let us get it through. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
If you can't get a policy through, it doesn't matter what your intent was, right? I'm sure every football team out there in the NFL has intended to win the Super Bowl. Look, not everybody gets a trophy, right? Like, come on.
Well, and this gets into the other thing is so what's the conversation looking like right now? Okay, the Democrats want to get these policies enacted. Where's the conversation? And how are they speaking to the other side? And I know in this very hyper-partisan environment that we have, it's very hard to see Republicans and Democrats bridging the gap on any issue, particularly the big issues that surround the economy and cultural stuff. However, where is the conversation on housing prices, right? For first-time home buyers, for young adults who want to start a family, right? Kamala Harris had mentioned that she wanted, to give, $25,000 to first-time home buyers. That's great, but that wasn't like at the forefront of her campaign because she had to make her campaign a referendum on Trump. So at the end of the day, you have to, what is the incentive that the system gives for politicians and for pundits and political consultants to prioritize a meaningful conversation to put solutions ahead of party politics?
Absolutely. So in these conversations you and I were having about these issues, I actually was also keeping an eye on the recent elections in Ireland because they have what I consider to be the gold standard of electoral systems, where they have this mix of proportional representation and ranked choice voting. Now, Ireland has been dealing with a lot of the same problems we've been dealing with in the US, which is we have this apparently booming economy, right? We have almost full employment, but there's a cost of living crisis. So home prices are up, rents are up, and to add all this, they have taken in a large number of immigrants and migrants over the past decade or so, right? Mm-hmm. So it very, very similar to what we're dealing with here, much smaller country. Now, Ireland on the whole is a fairly even-tempered country. However, a lot of this has started to come to a head, and we've seen the same tensions with some in Ireland over the large influx of new arrivals from all over Europe, all over the world, really. Now, this has resulted in some unrest. So last year, there were actually riots over the stabbing of 2 school kids by someone with far-right nationalist ties. Very unusual for the country. And so this recent election was a referendum on, the state of affairs, both over the civil unrest, but also over the cost of living crisis. Okay. Now, we talked about pronouncing Duggan and Duggan, right? We couldn't figure that one out. So I had to go through a whole course on pronouncing Ireland's political parties. Now, I actually asked Irish people to pronounce them for me. They all pronounce them different. So I'm going with the official RTE, that is the National Broadcaster of Ireland's pronunciation. So there are 2 center-rightish parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, who have really dominated the political scene since the founding of the Republic. And these 2 parties are like near identical. It's hysterical. Like, we talk about how Democrats and Republicans are too much alike. These people are like really, really alike. And their only real political differences have to do with, the Irish Civil War and whether they wanted to take a harder line against the British or accept the terms that the British extended them. And that's kind of been what these 2 parties have been founded on. And they've pretty much dominated for decades. So to give you an idea, in 2007, their combined vote share was 70%. Now, in the most recent election, that went down to 43%. Right? So these 2 parties, which, again, arguably could be considered the Republican Party, whatever you want to call it, have seen a decline, while a lot of smaller alternative parties have started to rise up. And this is where things get really interesting, because the traditional left-leaning parties are Sinn Féin. These folks were the political wing for the Irish Republican Army, and one of their tenets is Irish reunification. And then they've got Labour, which is maybe similar to what you might see in the UK, right? Center-left. And then you've got your Greens in there and whatnot. Now, during this election, there was also the presence of nationalist elements. And this is where things get interesting, because you and I talked about this last week, right? We talked about the populists. And these people are economically liberal and they're socially conservative. And as of late, they've started to align more, not entirely, but more with the Republican Party, because they just have a lack of faith that the government's going to get anything done. Well, Ireland sort of had that moment. And what happened is, because of Ireland's system, because they allocate seats proportionally, and because they have ranked choice voting, the nationalists saw a little bit of a gain, but not a lot. This populist vote didn't swing predominantly in one direction or the other. They kind of broke off into different left-leaning parties, nationalist parties, and so on. And so while the nationalists did gain, they didn't take over an entire party, right? So in this country, if you have an extremist political element, they either are entirely hidden in the shadows, or they take over a major political party, one or the other, right? And you see these civil wars going on within the parties now. You've seen them go on in years prior. So, let's just kind of keep things equal and say we have the more nationalist MAGA wing of the Republican Party vying for dominance, and let's just call it the defund the police wing on the Democratic side vying for dominance as well. In Ireland, they have the ability to be a bit more fluid. And so that means that nationalist elements don't necessarily have to take over a major political party in order to get a voice, which some might argue is a bad thing, but I would argue is better than the nationalist elements actually taking over a party and then winning all chambers of government.
I think when you look at Ireland, it is certainly a case for proportional representation. I think more so than any other country right now, in terms of what it could do to benefit the nation's politics. My only hesitation is, you started by explaining that this system has been in place since Ireland's founding. So they are used to the system. If we try to switch to that type of thing, we have been conditioned to view things only in 2 sides, of Republican and Democrat. So I'm not entirely convinced at the moment that just fracturing the parties at this point will lead to anything different in the U.S. But I think Ireland does present an interesting case study for the potential of, as you said, it's we wouldn't have, it wouldn't be a system where really a political minority is able to just gather enough votes to take over primary elections.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that, they're able to sail on to general election victories and take over a party completely.
Yeah. A couple things I'd say in response to that. First and foremost, I think if you're hearing this and you're thinking to yourself, well, if half the country thinks one way, half the country thinks the other way, the system works fine. The reality is half the country doesn't think one way. Half the country doesn't align with either party. Roughly about 25% think one way and 25% think the other way. And they're kind of dictating the agenda for everybody else. So to add to what you said, I think if you look at the Irish political system, they've had the ability to have multiple parties since their founding.
Yeah.
But the two major parties have always held a very large portion of the seats in government. And the only reason that's declined gets back to something we talked about earlier, which is a lot of people in Ireland don't feel the system is working for them, and they're starting to seek alternatives. And I think that is a much healthier expression of discontent than what we have here. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we have to break up the parties. That could simply mean that we set up a system where the individual members of Congress aren't as beholden to the national party. You and I talk about places like California with David Valadao, or Washington, or Alaska. These states all have nonpartisan, open primary systems that allow candidates to focus on the voters rather than focusing on the base.
And when you compare someone like Valadao with the Detroit mayor, right, they have very similar approaches to voters. They familiarize themselves with voters. They get on first name basis with voters, right? They listen to what voters are actually wanting, what they need. But what we could end up seeing is a very stark contrast between what two systems produce, particularly as the conversation develops with the Michigan governor's race. It's a 2026 race, so we still have 2 years before the actual election. But what you're going to see is that stark contrast on how Duggan is drowned out in the conversation, but Valadao is able to continue to win elections because he's been able to freely run as he wants to run.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Shawn, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today and you are not already a subscriber, please subscribe. We release episodes every week. And if you liked what you heard today and could leave us a review and rate the podcast, we would be most grateful. And if you liked what you heard today and there are other people you can think of who'd like it too, there's a 50% chance you do. Please be sure to tell them about this. This podcast grows by word of mouth, specifically your mouth. Theme music, courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.